Hi friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This lecture is on the book of 2 Samuel. In this lecture, I want to provide a brief overview and outline of the book as a whole, provide a few notes or remarks on a few focus passages, and offer some strategies for reading as well. So to begin with, what is a good outline for the book of 2 Samuel? Well, there's a number of different sections that hold together, and so I would say that the first 1 to 5 chapters or so really are about the conclusion of David's rise. Remember, this is a story that has started in 1 Samuel, and it's gonna go all the way in to the first 5 chapters of 2 Samuel. In chapters 6 and 7, this is the early time in David's career as the king. This is his work with the ark, as well as his engagement with the prophet Nathan. In chapters 8 through 10, we see a series of wars with the Philistines and the Ammonites and the Arameans. There's also some interesting stories about David's character, like his kindness to Jonathan's son in chapter 9. In chapters 11 and 12, we hear about one of the more infamous stories in David's life, his adulterous interaction with Bathsheba, his murderous intentions in eliminating Uriah, and the role of Nathan in speaking truth to power. This is also where we learn of the birth of Solomon, David's son through Bathsheba, as well as the death of Bathsheba's first child, who was the child of that adulterous interaction. In chapters 13 through 20, we learn of the rape of Tamar and Absalom's insurrection, one of David's sons. And so one of the things that as you read that part of 2 Samuel, you may wonder, are you meant to feel more bad about David and his sons and the sort of political and familial rivalry that results, or for Tamar, the victim of really terrible incident? In chapters 20 and 21, there's more warfare, more sort of consolidation of power by David. And then in chapters 22 through 24, we have some endings. There's this beautiful song of thanksgiving in chapter 22, which, if you know the Bible, is going to sound a whole lot like the Psalms, especially those that are attributed to David. There are some final words of David in chapter 23, and then a very interesting account of David's census, his desire to take an account of the people of Israel, and the Lord's reaction to it. That outline has a lot of information, and while it might be great to spend more than 1 week or maybe a couple of months even on 2 Samuel, we're reading through in a pretty rapid pace. And so I want to offer a few places where you might focus in your attention and your reading. The first of these is chapters 1 through 5. As I mentioned earlier, this is the conclusion of David's rise to power. And a few things to note here. First is, man, we're back into the world of Game of Thrones. There's violence and there's intrigue. You got people changing sides and their sort of associations. We see this cycle of violence that is associated with David, maybe not always caused by David, but doesn't seem very far behind David. We see a lament in chapter 1, 17 through 27, one of the oldest laments in the Bible. It's beautiful and heart-wrenching. You should check it out. In 3:1, we get this great line: there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Talk about an understatement. That's what's going on for the first part of 2 Samuel. And later in chapter 3, in verses 33 through 34, David says, "Today I am powerless, even though the anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too violent for me." And I think about the violence again, cycles of violence, and even David's response that these people are too violent for me. What does that say? What does that say about power and about human kingships and so forth? And then we see in chapter 4 this assassination of one of David's rivals, Ishbaal, and David's surprising, even brutal reaction. In chapter 5, it seems as though David's ruling over all, he's finally consolidated power. And then finally, something to note in these first 5 chapters is David's close relationship with God. It's as if they're dialogue partners. It's almost as if there's always clear direction. This will be important as we keep in mind the later parts of the stories and David's own shortcomings as a king and as a person. The second place to focus in is 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is really the first mention of the prophet Nathan, and Nathan sort of appears and then disappears in the story, but he plays an important role. And he speaks this oracle over David. He declares God's intentions for David and David's heirs. And it's really significant. So the substance of the oracle is that the house of God is David's heart. David is saying, God, I want to build you a house. You've never had a house. And God's intention is really to make a house out of David. And God seems to actually eschew and resist the desire for a house. We see as well in this oracle the information about David's legacy, that his offspring will actually build that house for the Lord, and that he will have a line of kings that follow him. In 7:14, we get this, what for Christians may seem like a strange definition of David's heirs as the sons of God. So that this idea that the king is the son of God in a special relationship with God. Of course, this is important for later notions of the Messiah, and specifically Jesus as the Messiah. In 7:16, God promises through Nathan, your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And this really expresses the sort of royal and theological sense of the Davidic monarchy. That it's not just David, but it's David's children and children's children. This idea that the kingdom and the throne will be established forever. Of course, if 2 Samuel is composed or edited or completed sometime after exile, this is a word, a promise that is hard for the Israelites to wrestle with, because they've just seen the kingdom of David be decimated. David's response to this oracle is, as we've seen with Moses and other characters in the Old Testament, is, who am I, O Lord God? It's a humility. David, again, takes a posture of humility. And we see in David's response that he illustrates some of the key characteristics of God. God is the Redeemer of Israel, as well as the God of conquest. We see that in 7:23 through 24. It's hard really to understate the significance of this oracle for later Judaism and early Christianity. It's a key text for the Davidic monarchy. It is a key text for the royal ideology that we see developing in the Psalms and elsewhere in the writings of the Old Testament, but also the royal ideology and the expectations of a Jewish Messiah that we see in other rival Jewish groups in the first century and before, like those that are suggested by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, we see in the New Testament the sometimes great lengths that the authors go to maintain Jesus's connection to this house of David, even though, as the Gospels will say, that Jesus's true father was not Joseph, but the Holy Spirit. The third thing to sort of zero in on is, of course, David's adultery and his plot to murder Uriah in chapters 11 and 12. This is one of the stories that I think is probably most familiar to many people. And so I invite you to read for the details. See what you've missed in the past. See how the sermons and the Sunday school versions have missed something in the story. I'd like you also to think about, what are David's missteps? What has changed from that close relationship with God, that dialogue partner with God, to the decisions and the cycles of decisions that he makes in 11 and 12? At the narrative level, pay attention to David's unrighteousness and the great lengths that he is going to hide that unrighteousness, and the result is more unrighteousness and more covering up and so forth. And yet, in comparison, is Uriah, who is righteous almost to a fault, almost to the point of his death, even to the point of his death. Pay attention to Nathan's role, the prophet's role, to speak truth to power. And then finally, pay attention to the consequences. It is a tragic story on so many levels. But I think we really miss something if we think only David is the victim. You know, we sort of get David's perspective from the Psalms, the beautiful psalm confessing his sin. And yet Uriah dies. Bathsheba's first child dies. And so while it introduces problems into David's life, there's far deeper consequences that reverberate through other people's lives. And one question with that is, does anything really bad happen to David? And how do you feel about that? The fourth thing that you might want to sort of zero in on is the rape of Tamar in chapter 13 and the consequences, the fallout from that. And I've already mentioned this. It's again a tragic and troubling story. And so you might look at Amnon, her brother, and his desires and even his plotting. He goes sort of out of his way to get Tamar alone and to really carry out this rape. It's really premeditated. It's really troubling. And then think about Tamar. Not only is she innocent, she's also a victim. I can't help but think about all of the people that were aware of Amnon's desires and his intentions, and yet they allowed Amnon to be alone with her and allowed Amnon to make requests for her to be sort of locked in the room. It's so troubling. And then there is the response of Absalom, Amnon's brother, and this delayed retribution and the sort of series of events that it starts off. And then there's David's reaction. David's reaction to the death of his son, Amnon, and the rape of his granddaughter. Just, again, it's so hard. And we see in 12:10, the narrator says, the sword shall never depart. Again, are these more consequences of that Bathsheba incident? Finally, pay attention, if you will, to the final chapter, chapter 24. And I don't want to spoil it for you. So just pay attention to what happens. What does David do wrong? And what kind of ending is this to the book of 2 Samuel? I think earlier in this lecture, I've already given you a few strategies for reading, but here are a few more specific ones. This first one will come as no surprise if you've watched any of these videos, and it is pay attention to the type of person David is. What about his character is positive? What about it is negative? And what about it is ambivalent? And as you do so, think about the purpose of this portrait of David. Is it, as some interpreters have suggested, sort of royal propaganda to prop him up as the sort of golden boy of Israel? Is it an apology for the way in which he took over the kingdom from Saul? Or is it perhaps more rounded or even honest than either of those approaches suggest? Second, what do you notice about power? What about the story of David teaches us something about power, about the desire to have power and to consolidate power, and about what does power do to a person? How can the story of David be a means of interpreting our own desires for power or our own culture of interaction and desire for power? Finally, also ask who has power in these stories and who does not. And of course, finally, as always, pay attention to what's going on inside of you as you read. What are your reactions? Sit with those, journal about those, write them down, and be ready to share them with me. All right, probably a lot more that we could say about 2 Samuel. It's possible that I mixed up some of the familial relationships, but you'll keep me honest. But I appreciate your time and look forward to hearing what you think about 2 Samuel.